Hi, I'm Andrew Sears, and I want to share a typology I've developed on faith-based organizations. So I've worked with thousands of faith-based organizations over the past 25 years. I've read just about every typology that's out there on faith-based organizations and have looked at them and realized that the current situation that a lot of faith-based organizations are facing, a different typology would be helpful. So that's why I developed this. You can look at some of the references for other typologies that I built on. But the basic idea behind this, and not that typologies could fall into one dimension of theologically conservative to liberal, but you have to kind of oversimplify things. So to a certain extent, that's the way I'm going to organize this. There's a big point that theological conservatism and liberalism is very different from political conservatism and liberalism in most of the world. In the U.S., those have been politically aligned, but that's not common in most of the world. So I'm not trying to make a political alignment statement. Now, the other thing I would say on this spectrum is, boundaries around things related to faith. The most traditional are going to have the strongest boundaries. This other side is going to have the most flexible boundaries. So basically, there's 5 categories: most traditional, and then you have traditional, you have critical mass, FBO, and I'm going to talk a lot about that because I feel like that's probably the most interesting right now. There's protected pluralist FBO, and there's what I call amorphous pluralist. So that means you kind of have amorphous boundaries, faith-based organization. Now, a lot of the other typologies that are out there, they might blow up this category, amorphous pluralist, into 3 or 4 different types. I am trying to create categories for a lot of the organizations that we've worked with. And traditionally, those are organizations that have been a little more on the theologically conservative end of the spectrum. So let me get into the details of what am I talking about for these different categories. So I'm going to share this slide. There's a lot of information on there, and I'm going to first kind of go through the core thing. So the most traditional, and probably the most important thing that's going to delineate different typologies of faith-based organizations, and honestly, the biggest factor in terms of is an organization, more likely to secularize, is religious hiring requirements. So for the most traditional, they not only require staff to be Christians, but theologically conservative Christians, often with additional strict measures of faith commitment, active in a small group or other, more intuitive measures. Then on the traditional, often they'll require all staff to be Christians, often mostly theologically conservative, or sometimes, theologically conservative to moderate, but not theologically liberal, with additional measures of faith commitment. Critical mass will require staff to be Christian with various levels of commitment. Typically, for a lot of these organizations, they'll try intentionally to have a critical mass of theologically conservative Christians. And then protected pluralist. This is a category largely for the Salvation Army, but there's others, and I think this will also become a more interesting category over time. They have a protected staff tier and clergy tier, and on one level, it's not fair putting them on the right side because they're actually more strict for the protected tier within the Salvation Army. It's a lifetime commitment, and they have to align with the full denominational beliefs of the Salvation Army at that tier. But the Salvation Army will hire other people at other tiers. And then amorphous pluralist will often, these organizations intentionally try to hire Christians when possible, but have a significant number of non-Christian staff. So, then you have the spectrum of core theology, where the most traditional is going to be the most theologically conservative. And often I'd characterize them as fundamentalist friendly. They might have, a portion of their staff that are fundamentalist, and, portion of their partners, significant portion of their partners that are fundamentalist. And then over here, you have more theologically moderate to liberal. Now, this is important, the common geographical context. So part of the idea behind the course that this lecture is related to is that if you misalign with your context, then there's a cost to that. That doesn't mean that you don't want to misalign, but often the most traditional is going to be more common in the Bible Belt, the Midwest and the South in the United States, in smaller cities. Traditional is going to be fairly similar. Critical mass often are organizations that started being more on traditional, but because they grew or because their city's demographic changed, they had to adapt in many cases. So often these are the more cosmopolitan and coastal progressive cities. And then protected pluralist is going to vary, and the amorphous pluralist, often will be more, thrive more in these locations. But they could be anywhere. And then some examples of this. So the most traditional are what I'd call the traditional adult and teen challenge. And then traditionals, typically most gospel rescue missions, Celebrate Recovery. This would be rescue missions in progressive cities, the Salvation Army. Amorphous pluralist would be 12-step programs, many independent Christian recovery programs. And then there's kind of different other questions. So the primary program staff education background. So most traditional is going to get their folks from Bible schools or maybe program graduates, Bible schools, Christian colleges, and secular colleges. Some secular schools and some Christian colleges, often hiring mostly Christians from secular schools. And then primarily secular schools for most of their people, except for the protected tier. And then, this group basically doesn't have a whole lot of value for Christian education, or may see limited value for Christian education, and they don't really care as much where people are getting educated. The board requirements typically are going to be, and this is just considered a best practice, to follow the same as at least what you're doing for your staff. But often these most traditional will make sure that they have many pastors on their board. Traditional has some pastors. Critical mass often is primarily selected for influence with some values alignment. And that's honestly, from my perspective, this is what's happening. But I think this actually may be the biggest problem and the biggest risk factor right now for a lot of these organizations in terms of secularization. And then, these are selected primarily for influence. Boundaries on funding. Most traditional are never going to accept government funding, and most of their donors are going to be Christian, individual donors. Here, traditional, primarily Christian with some secular donors. If this group ever accepts government funding, typically they don't, but if they do, it's going to be in rare circumstances where it's highly protected. And then in this category, accept government funding with strategic boundaries, may have many secular donors. And then the amorphous pluralist is accept all funding with no boundaries and with large government funding. Support from the church, the most support, with the most conservative churches to, broader support. And then you get into things of, okay, what's going to be different about we work a lot with organizations that serve individuals that are homeless or residential recovery. So I'm going to use these as examples, but you could have other examples for different types of programs. So for residential recovery programs, must make a faith decision before program participation, and requiring complete abstinence from all substances, including smoking, while in the program. Traditional, sometimes, they may, and typically they would say, make a faith decision before program participation, and abstinence from drugs and alcohol. Smoking sometimes is allowed, sometimes not, but typically strongly discouraged. Here you have a critical mass of clients that make a decision while in the program, and you have tiers of abstinence from drugs and alcohol, meaning that you might have, operate a wet shelter, but require complete sobriety for residential recovery, or you might have other groups that aren't in your recovery program. And then often smoking's allowed, and then On the amorphous pluralist, generally you're just going to let clients know that they're joining a program based in Christian faith. And then there's other things like attitudes towards psychoactive medications. This group is the most skeptical, often will ban most prescribed psychoactive medications while in the program, which honestly is probably the most controversial of some of the decisions that this group might do. This will be skeptical of psychoactive medications and ban any addictive psychoactive medications while in the program, potentially addictive. There's a lot of potentially addictive psychoactive medications that people will get prescribed. Here you have critical masses, balanced skepticism, may ban some psychoactive medications while in the program. So for example, don't have people who are actively using methadone in the residential recovery program. And then this group here generally is not going to have any limits on that. And they might even partner with methadone clinics. And then there's kind of the model of training and counseling model. So in the most traditional, it's primarily Bible teaching with chaplains or some sort of minister functioning as what I would call a relational case manager. And here you might have a mixture of people who are clinical counseling or case management model with chaplains. And then here you have a mix, but generally the clinical counselors are dominant. And then in this model here, it's almost exclusively clinical counselors and case managers without people who are functioning as ministers in that mix. So that's one way of characterizing the typology. Now, is that I mentioned the conservatism and theological conservatism. There's a distinction. It's important to recognize this distinction. And you have philosophical conservatism, you have theological conservatism, and there's a danger for equating theological conservatism with political conservatism. A lot of the organizations we work with are on social issues for a lot of issues like serving the poor, serving refugees and things along those lines. They would be considered progressive. But they're theologically conservative. So, and for most of the world, that's kind of where Christians are, is they're active in their community. And there isn't much correlation between theological conservatism and political conservatism. A lot of people globally say that the U.S. Is because the fact that theological conservatism has equated to political conservatism, they believe that Christians have assimilated and to become a political ideology branch of the Republican Party, at least some Christians now. Okay, so let's talk about the role of these different groups, because a lot of times these typologies, it's basically a way to judge each other. You say, well, you're over there and you're liberal, you're bad, or vice versa, right? So I like Jesus' model of ministry as a model for the roles and types of faith-based organization. So he had his 3 closest disciples. He had the 12, he had the 120, he had the 5,000, the crowds, and then there's everyone else, right? So there's kind of tiers of ministry, and you can kind of have the same type of thing. So there's the most traditional, and this would be like the traditional adult and teen challenge and strongly conservative Christian recovery program. So, in terms of being able to serve the widest audience, it's not going to serve the widest audience, and they're intentional about that. That's a part of it. Then you have many rescue missions that are out there, and they're strongly Christian. They provide shelter and recovery. That's going to be broader. And then you have what I call a critical mass rescue mission, and that's Springs Rescue Mission. Now, I meet with several hundred organizations that are serving the homeless a year, and probably a good percentage of those are in regions where either they are the only homeless shelter or they are the primary homeless shelter in their city. So, for a lot of theologically conservative homeless shelters, there's a question of, are you a wet shelter or are you a dry shelter? Meaning, would you allow someone to come in after they've been drinking? And a lot of theologically conservative shelters don't allow that because the impact that could have on client culture and client safety. Now, There's it gets to be a lot more complex if you are the only shelter in your city, or you're the largest shelter in a region where people might die if you don't let them in the shelter during the winter. So for in a lot of cases, they kind of have to follow a critical mass strategy. So and I think it's important to recognize the differences, in these contexts. And then you have protected pluralist in the Salvation Army. So I've been told by people in the Salvation Army, they are serving needs in every zip code in the United States. That is at a scale that most rescue missions can't really think about. And it's a lot more complicated in the decisions you have to make whenever you're doing something like that, of how do you deal with government funding? How do you deal with hiring? You have a lot more context than, the average organization. And then here, if you're trying to deal with a problem like affordable housing in California, you need to be at a scale, or, say New York City, you need to be at a scale that is just beyond what most of the missions, a lot of these missions might have 1,000 beds. Well, what if you need to get 100,000 beds? That's a different type of problem. Now, here's what's important to recognize is that as you move to this larger scale, as your primary mission is serving, the crowds, and as you move up, your secularization risk is much higher. I look at a lot of people who've been popular in pop culture, and they're Christians popular in pop culture, like say Bono. Christian rock stars don't have a great success rate. But those that do stay true to their values, and people can debate, did Bono do that or not? They have pretty big impact in terms of their influence on society. And so anyway, it's worth looking at the pros and cons. Now, there's some other key lessons from the faith-based organization Typology. And the first of these is that being misaligned in one domain from your model has a cost. So, for example, if you're following the most traditional model in a cosmopolitan progressive city, but there's going to be a challenge. Now, whenever I have this statement saying don't follow this legalistically, someone could misapply this typology and say, well, I'm in this category of the critical mass, so therefore we should be doing this because Andrew showed that in his row. That's just dumb. You have to think these things through, but the point is, if you are going to be ultra right wing and you're living in an ultra left wing city, you have to assess, count the costs, basically is the point. And is that going to be the best strategies? I've seen, as an example, I was in Boston, and Southern Baptists did church plants there. They did not emphasize the fact that they were Southern Baptists. They usually had names that sounded like they were cool, instead of, First Southern Baptist Church, or, the 14th Southern Baptist Church of Boston. So they had to adapt their model. Secularization typically starts with funding, board, and senior staff. If you accept, funding, if you have a board that is not tightly aligned with your values, usually, that's going to direct things. And I've seen many boards that they fire the senior staff because they're misaligned and they want to keep growing, and the senior staff are more concerned about their values. So, or you hire a new CEO and all of a sudden that person, secularizes because they don't share the values. Recognize that different faith-based organization models have different strengths and risk. The secularization trend encourages moving towards the amorphous model. Now, a lot of people are like, well, why is that a bad thing? Well, let's just imagine that all the black churches went away. Let's just imagine that all, teaching of black history went away. Let's just imagine that, essentially what you're doing is you're extinguishing a culture. Now, there are aspects of the Christian culture we've created that are very God-giving, And if you start to eliminate institutions and only have institutions that are becoming more and more secularized and more assimilated, then you're losing the culture is the problem. Now, as organizations grow, the risk to secularize often increases. And this is probably the primary point. If an organization moves to a critical mass model, you need to have intentional values alignment strategies and training to offset the natural secularization trend. If I had to summarize what's happening in society right now and how we need to adapt, is more ministries are going to have to look at the critical mass model. But whenever I see what they're doing, they're not doing it in an informed way. And that's why whenever I showed the diagram saying that I think that 3/4 of the ministries are going to secularize, it's because it's hard to do the critical mass model without secularizing unless you're very intentional. So that gets into this kind of, risk of secularization. So most traditional has small risk of secularization, but you have a high risk of legal ostracism. So in the Northeast, in the West, so this might be where you get in battles with your state or your city over religious hiring rights. And then there's a risk of cultural irrelevant. If you are, say, in a city like Detroit that is 90% non-white, and your leadership is 90% white male, evangelical, that's going to create increasing tensions. And you have to, be thinking about that. And then there's risk of government investigations. So a lot of organizations, including my organization in the past, was targeted politically for really unfair practices, but it was just someone's political agenda. And it was back in a day, we had a different model then and took government grants. And because of that, we got targeted. So, and then there's are you at risk of legalism? So critical mass is really the one that's going to be the highest risk for government investigation. This group's not a risk because they don't take government funding. This group's not a risk because they basically don't hire based on faith and aren't going to be sued. Often here on both sides, there's a risk of legalism. Here you can have conservative legalism. Here you have liberal legalism. And, I think that part of the idea is be aware of mission drift, be aware, I think especially of critical mass. Generally, most critical mass organizations don't want to become the amorphous pluralist. If you're an amorphous pluralist, that's your mission. That's what God's called you to do. I'm not judging, that group, but the point is whenever an organization moves from most traditional to critical mass and then amorphous pluralism, that is the secularization trend. So let me just try to fill out these models a little bit more. We talked about, how strong the boundaries are. So traditional and most traditional have very strong boundaries. You can think of this, thick wall here. You have very clear boundaries and dividing lines. So have strongly Christian staff, Christian clients and recovery programs, and mostly Christian programs. So that's the traditional and most traditional. And basically everything that's secular is kind of kept out more strongly to varying degrees, right? And then you have a critical mass strategy with staff and client. So this is in contrast, where it's kind of like, you have two categories. You have Christian and you have secular. Critical mass is more like you have the core. So at your core culture that you're really protective of, you have highly committed, Bible-centered, and I use that as kind of a term for theologically conservative Christian professionals. And then you might have the broader ministry culture, and you get Christian professionals, and often these may be amazing Christians, but they have secular training. So if they're a counselor, most of their training, whether they know it or not, is based on secular worldviews. And without additional training, you're not going to know how to counsel from a Christian worldview extensively as you would if you had that training. Now, clients often, are those, say, in residential recovery, people who are currently following Jesus, and then you have this other tier. So you might have non-Christian volunteers, which used to be a more common strategy. Now there's a lot of legal risk with those, and generally, where the boundary line is this: these organizations do not hire non-Christian staff. If you hire non-Christian staff, you're not critical mass anymore. You're amorphous pluralist because you can't retain your culture very well. So ultimately, what this is about: critical mass strategy. So you only hire Christian staff. That is basically the defining aspect of it. Theological perspective aligned with ministry values is a privileged voice in ongoing conversation. So what that means is you guys are gonna, people can believe, within certain bounds. Not everyone is going to have a, say, theologically conservative perspective on your staff. You might have some that are moderate, or you have to decide how liberal this you may be comfortable with, but the core teaching might come from a theological conservative space. And then you accept staff that aren't at the center of the values, but you have ongoing training to improve alignment. I would say for the average ministry, about a third of the Christians they hire might, without theological training, might believe, certain things that, like, all roads lead to God, and things that just aren't even consistent with the Apostles' Creed. And then accept non-Christian clients, but they know the ministry's values, and you don't allow opposing values to dominate, so that, the client, the non-Christian client culture doesn't become dominant. So City Vision is a model of critical mass. So, we have Bible-centered Christians typically serving the poor and the addicted. That's about 60% of our students. So that's tier 1. And then we have tier 2, which is Christians in nonprofit professions. They may not be serving the poor and the addicted. We might have program graduates from a lot of our ministry partners. So that's tier 2. So that's maybe 90% of our students. And then tier 3, sometimes we get non-Christians accepting that are just seeking affordable, nonprofit or addiction counseling degrees. We get Christians seeking affordable degrees. And we get international students that aren't serving the poor, but they might be in internet NGOs or parachurch ministries. And then there's everyone else. So most of our courses and our content are serving tiers 1 and 2. We try to serve everyone as a part of our idea, but this is kind of the critical mass area. So for us, Bible-centered, theologically conservative perspective, most of our teaching, like our theology courses and things like that, is a privileged voice in ongoing conversation. Not everyone has to agree, but this is, what we're going to teach in our courses. And we accept non-Christians, but we try to be very clear that this is a Christian context, and we're not, and we don't allow secular ideologies to dominate. So contrasting those two models, the critical mass strategy versus firm boundaries. So the key questions are: how will you define your religious commitment boundary for staff and board? If you aren't requiring your staff and board to be Christian, then you're not critical mass, you're amorphous. It's basically the definition. And on what factors will you allow a critical mass strategy, with clients and other things? So for example, there's different theological boundaries. So you might say you follow evangelical theology and you use the evangelical statement of faith, or you might have Protestant theology and may use a Protestant statement of faith, or allow Protestant and Catholic. So you would use the Apostles' Creed or Nicene Creed. So, and this might influence your staffing. So part of it is, is this a hard boundary? So everyone has to not only sign the statement of faith, but actually, be kind of practicing in that space? Or are you going to have everyone sign an evangelical statement of faith and then different levels of, faith commitment, and how do you define those? And, if you hire Protestants and Catholics, are you trying to be critical mass Protestant, or does that even matter to you? So with critical mass strategy, a privileged voice in ongoing conversation is kind of the phrase. that, everyone, you might have staff discussion, but there's, the staff who are invited to say lead in chapel are going to be the ones that, support your core theology. And then most teaching in the ministry is rooted in a theology that's reflecting the privileged voice. You have ensure a critical mass of senior staff, and that's the most important, that have strong faith aligned with critical mass theology. Or you could have a firm boundary for specific tiers, like Salvation Army does for their officers. And part of the reason why a lot of organizations are moving to critical mass is once they get to be a really large organization, you have to get people who are competent, and you need a certain level of professionalization. And sometimes you can't find someone who is, insanely values aligned with every aspect of your values and can get the job done. And if, it's someone who's doing accounting, or, some other function, you have to think about what level of values alignment is important. If you have someone who's your chief, ministry teaching officer, that's going to be a lot more important to be theologically aligned than, say, someone who's, doing janitorial work, right? So then those are critical mass strategies, and then firm boundary strategy, is, say you're going to have that around evangelical, ensure all staff have strong faith in evangelical theology, or that all teaching reflects evangelical theology. So there's kind of two strategies here, that you how much dissent do you allow, how much are you focused on critical mass, versus sticking to your core values. Now, I want to also talk about critical mass strategies in Christian associations, because I think increasingly different groups are going to need to be thinking about this. So honestly, the best practice out here, I think, is by the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, CCCU, in the United States. This is the primary association for Christian colleges and universities. And they follow two different critical mass strategies. One is critical mass employment policies, and they require that all their members, and you can see this diagram, they have 5 different membership categories, and their critical mass strategies. And then they have different alignment. So if you're going to be a governing member or an associate member, you have to have employment policies where you only hire for Christians, for governing and associate members. Honestly, for an association, I think that is the most important factor, because I think that there's a whole lot of legal reasons and there's a whole lot of historical reasons, but I've read probably 50 books in this space, and I can't think of a single case of an organization in the long term that did not have a firm boundary on hiring only Christians, where that organization did not secularize. There may be cases out there, but I've read 50 to 100 books and met with thousands and thousands of organizations. I have not encountered one yet. And I'm talking about who's been around for a long time. You can stay like that for maybe a decade or two, but you're not going to be able to stay like that over, say, a period of 50 to 100 years. The other category they have, and this isn't necessarily related to religious, it just has to do with the fact that CCCU is about supporting Christian liberal arts. So this they have this institution type that's here, and so they say institution type and accreditation. So they have different categories. But what's interesting here is they have to support the Christian mission, and then they have distinctives informing advocacy. And if you read those, basically it's going to be pretty hard for them to be a member without being theologically conservative. So this is one approach to strategy. I love how transparent they are about this. I think that this is basically a best practice, and my hope is that more organizations will do that. Now, here's why I wanted to develop this typology is, as we've worked with organizations, and we've worked with over 1,000 organizations, faith-based organizations, what I've seen is there's this trend, and so where is your dominant culture in your organization? And I would say there's this trend that happens where you have the most traditional FBO, faith-based organization, that's usually smaller. And then over time, this organization will over time, because as they grow, they have to get staff that this is what I would describe as the core culture, the cultural center of the organization. They have to get staff that are just a lot more competent, a lot more professional. Because if you have a $40 million organization and you're serving thousands of people, especially if it's a high risk audience, you might have a lot more people die, because if you have people who don't really know what they're doing on a professional level. So this is kind of a natural tendency to happen. And in doing that, your values alignment goes down. So your cultural center, your values alignment goes down. Now, and you have what I describe this frontier of staff quality. One of the main reasons why City Vision exists in supporting organization is, in what we're trying to do in this course, is we're trying to partner with ministries to increase their professionalization without decreasing values alignment. So what you can do is develop an intensive values training and values alignment plan. That's really the purpose of this course. So, and ultimately what you can do is change the frontier of staff quality. Part of what's needed is most people are still living in an industrial economy, and that the idea behind the industrial economy is you get trained in your job, you go to college, and you don't need that much education, and you stay in the same job for 40 years. Now we're in a knowledge economy, and honestly, most ministries need to be investing 5 to 10 fold in terms of their total staff training. And if you're not investing a lot more in your staff training, and I'm not saying that most of that actually needs to be internal, but a lot of that you can outsource to groups like City Vision. So hopefully this typology is helpful for you. And if you have any questions, please ask your professor.